All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Samantha, and on behalf of Carahsoft, I would like to welcome you to our Latent AI webinar, From Bureaucracy to Breakthroughs, Accelerating Edge AI for Warfighter Dominance. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's presentation. Jags Kandasamy, CEO and co-founder of Latent AI, retired General James Cartwright, 8th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, U.S. Marine Corps, retired Lieutenant General David Bassett, U.S. Army, retired Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, United States Air Force, and retired Rear Admiral Doug Small, Latent AI, and U.S. Navy. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers of the day. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Samantha. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar around specifically JSIDs. Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War now announced the sunset of JSIDs and sent a memo out in August. We want to use this opportunity, and we have the best of the best minds from the US DoD assembled here to discuss this. Want to ask these questions and see how the next generation of requirements, right? How do we get what the warfighter needs, and how do we develop that, and how do we deliver that to the warfighter as we look to sunset JSIDs? With that, I'll turn it over to Jim to start off the questions, right? Like, Jim, you were one of the as a vice chairman, you ran the JSIDs process at the Pentagon. What do you see as the shift? And we've talked about this several times around how we need to transition from this. Given the initiative from the Secretary of Defense and from the current administration, what do you think are the next steps? And love to hear your thoughts around that.
Thanks, Jags, and thanks for pulling this together. My sense here, and now that we've had a little bit of time to read through at least the unclass or the public available document, and to get some sense of how they're thinking about implementation. The idea of sunsetting JSIDs is probably long overdue. Not so much from its performance. It gets a bad rep, and it sometimes deserves a bad rep. But the reality here is that you have to have some means by which you understand what the needs are forecast. The reality also is that as we have entered into this digital age, there is a fundamental difference between building an airplane as a manufacturing process and the software that can go into it to, some people call future proof, but the idea being that I can keep up with the current needs with software much better than I could with hardware alone. And so this was overdue. That framework was overdue. A lot of these conversations go into why not JSIDs. I think that what's more important is why and what is coming, and do you have a chance of making it work? And if there is criticism out there right now for this activity, it is to say, okay, we changed the names, but it's the same people. Okay, it's the same organizations, and they have the same roles. And so, how do you expect that to go forward? And there are some great words like consider, advise, particularly to the so-called edge. And so there's going to have to be some bureaucratic overcoming of inertia to make this work. And that's going to be really hard. Nobody should underestimate that activity. But I think the three big leverage points that I took out of the activity, the reading, if you wanted to read it in a very positive light and you wanted to basically see what could I do here, one is to think about the need for future capabilities from a standpoint of top down, which is saying that the control side of this equation, which would be the Department of War and the services, how do they play? And then bottom up, how does the edge play in this activity? And what's fundamentally different here is that the digital age has brought a capability, an opportunity for the edge to have a much better voice. Data informed, the ability to articulate up. Now, will that work? I don't know. But analytics that I have seen thus far would say that if you have some top down and you have some bottom up and you have edge, you have about an 80% chance of doing something determinatively different and better than what you had. So they have the right ideas. Whether in top down, I think what people are hoping is that services and large leadership activities will focus on interoperability and standards for the entire institution. And that at the bottom up side of the equation, that the role of the combatant commander, the CJTF, that they will have a determinative voice, not an informing voice, not a voice that, okay, I'll make a list for every year. I'll give you a couple of things that I really need or 100 things I really need, but a fundamentally dynamic activity, which they're calling these KOPs, a determinative activity there that is a living and dynamic activity. If unfortunately, as you read it, it says once a year, that's not going to work. Okay, that's falling back into the trap. We're going to need and have to have something that is dynamic, is regional, because essentially the voice of the regional combatant commander or JTF leader has a context in which they are operating. And that context is unique. And the opportunity at the edge is to take that uniqueness and employ it before the conflict and during the conflict and out adapt and out adopt your adversary. So to me, that's where the secret sauce is. The question is, can you get past the institutional inertia that holds it back?
That's a great segue to bring Dave in, right? Like Dave was on your staff at the Joint Chiefs back when he was in 06. Dave, you were part of this bureaucracy, the organization that was bringing in the requirements. Given Jim's comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts and how you would approach.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jags, and thanks for hosting us all today. Uh, when I look back at the legacy process and back at the way that JSIDS was used, it presumed that once you'd been informed by the community, that you could be really confident in what it was that the requirements process would demand, and then you would be willing to invest time and money to make it exactly what the requirements writers had described. And so, I think this process of changing and shifting from the previous JSIDS process started a number of years ago when the department introduced mid-tier acquisition authorities that did not require JSIDS approved documents. And I think it also shifted to an acknowledgement that with the kinds of advanced technologies we're seeing today, you don't always know exactly what's the art of the possible for technology. And you don't know where, as you begin to develop systems and get them into the hands of warfighters, those systems might able to be evolved to and become. And so it's kind of what I think I'm hoping that the shift in this requirements process becomes is one that doesn't presume with precision what the material solutions will be, but instead articulates the problem. So the fact that they're using that term, key operational problem, I think is a really good news, because once we would arrive at requirements, we would frequently try the behaviors of the people. And I know I watched Doug sort of nodding yes to this idea that it's the same people and you've got the same people trying to implement a new process. But what the behavior of the people would be is sometimes your operational folks would try to make the requirement so specific that only the thing they wanted could come out of the acquisition system. And it constrained industry in terms of their ability to innovate things perhaps that the warfighter hadn't even thought of. And so where I'm really hoping this goes is that requirements process becomes, I'll call it, more of an enabling function than a forcing function. So we're not trying to create requirements to force something into existence, regardless of the trade-offs or regardless of what it costs, but rather give industry some running room to demonstrate the art of the possible, iterate with users on what that system can be, and hopefully in some ways discipline our requirements process so that we're not making trade-offs that in the long run aren't good, either demanding things that are too costly or that cause trade-offs that perhaps at the time the requirements are approved, people don't even recognize. So I don't think, shifting from JSONs is not new. We started it when we started doing mid-tier acquisition. And again, I'm hoping this becomes a technology-led process rather than, having, I don't want to call it arrogance, but we're so confident in what we want that we say you can't trade, there's no trade-offs. You have to make exactly what the JROC said they wanted because they're not all knowing. Despite my experience working for General Cartwright, it turns out they're not all knowing. Uh, and being open to that in terms of seeing what can be done with available technology.
Got it. Thanks, Dave. Thank you. Uh, Jack, you set up the Jake. You were like the founder within the department when you stood up the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, right? And you actually, like 10 years ago, you started a technology movement within, and you had to go work with Silicon Valley in making some of these things come to life, right? From that lens, as well as the discussions that we are having today, love to hear your opinion.
Yeah, thanks, Jack, and really happy to be part of the experience level on here. I agree with everything that's been said so far. So let me just reinforce a couple of things going back to our early days of Project Maven. The 5 letters we tried never to say, even in Maven or in the Jake, were JSIDs because they were absolutely antithetical to what we were trying to do, which was move quickly. Everything that Os Cartwright said about how fast can you adapt, what's the changing situation in the battlefield, in this case, really the battlefield in Iraq, Afghanistan, Horn of Africa. So it was very interesting in the early days of Maven. The way we worked ourselves around this was I actually gave some homework to the Marine Corps colonel running the team to go find existing requirements in the system that we could just point to and say there is already an existing requirement, alleviating us from having to go down the JSIDS path. But also we were designated RDT&E, which was very helpful. Sure enough, there were hundreds of requirements somewhere in the system that said automation, autonomy, AI, all these things that we could point to and said that's sufficient evidence that gives us the ability to move forward on these projects. So we never had to, if it would have been JSIDS, quite honestly, Maven would not have been fielded today, 8 years later. The only reason we were able to do it is we could move at the speed of relevance, as we say. And same thing happened by the time we got to the Jake, or I stood up the Jake. About all the projects we had going, we never really had to talk about JSIDS because they were just emerging requirements that existed somewhere already in the system. So as much as I actually would like to be encouraged by this memo that came out, in some ways, I'm more encouraged by a memo that came out on March 6th of 2025 that the secretary said, go use the commercial software acquisition pathway. Dave referred to mid-tier of acquisition. That was a big start. Now directing people, if you can, and everybody should be able to use the commercial software acquisition pathway. Commercial should be your default position. Use this thing called commercial solutions openings, other transaction authorities, both for the requirement solicitation, then for the contracting vehicle. For a company like Latent, I think that will make more difference than just JSID saying that the JROC has disappeared. I like the idea in principle of key operational problems. As both Haas and Dave have said, now what are you going to do with those? Is this thing called the RRAB, the Requirements and Resourcing Alignment Board, and the Mission Engineering and Integration Activity, are they capable of using that to actually drive rapid change on the joint side? And just the fact that we didn't have JSIDs in both Maven and Jake did not mean that I didn't go to the Joint Staff J8 to get their support. You really must have the Joint Staff imprimatur on all this stuff, because if it's just OSD, everybody on this call knows how OSD is viewed from the military services side. So you've got to get that Joint Staff buy-in, and we did. Very fortunate to have strong endorsement for the Joint Staff. Then that helped us go back to the services, give reinforcing fires to the people that already supported our projects, and push it up the hill. So this idea of top-down and bottom up are so critical to this. What I don't see in this memo, and I'll close with this, is how that bottom up bottom-up piece is really supposed to work. And it really is going to be very dependent on getting the two sides, one pushing from below, the other pushing from above, and then driving the program executive offices and the system program offices to move a lot faster. And that's where a lot of the empowerment should remain, or it should actually be placed. In some cases, it hasn't existed enough. Put it down to the SPOs and the PEOs, let them make those big portfolio decisions and drive as fast as humanly possible. So if we had to live by the JSIDS process in either of those two AI organizations, we would have shut down because we would have never gotten anywhere with it.
Thanks, Jack. Doug, we worked on with you at Project Overmatch, and I think Overmatch, what Dave mentioned and Jim talked about and Jack talked about, right? Like technology leading the forefront of this this process. You actually showed it to the world, implementing Overmatch and bringing some of those technological advances into the warfighter's hand and actually implementing them rather than calling it a prototype and running wildly in circles around it. Right? You prototyped it, you fielded it, and you called it a win. It was getting distributed. How did you approach this? And then as we see, as we move forward in this new round, what are your thoughts around
it? Just to kind of add on, a lot of the thoughts that have already been, but I'll say, aligning the authorities in our case, it was like aligning authorities in a single accountable person that is accountable to naval leadership and has the buy-in from the people who set the requirements on behalf of, with and on behalf of the chief of naval operations was allowed us to be able to move pretty quickly. And I think my sort of big picture thought on the JSIDS part beyond the machinery of how it works is getting past the bureaucratic inertia that's been described, but not just at the joint staff level, but in all the services too. Is that we tend to focus on JSIDS, and the JROC and what happens up there. That is the very last step on big ticket items or items that people have decided they really want to be. It's all the way down through the services, the same sort of mentality. Those conditions need to be set that we want to be able to move faster with things like software and technology-driven solutions at the edge and set up those conditions where people can move at speed, but drive it through the entire organization, not just at the joint staff level. That would be sort of my input on that. But setting those conditions, I think, is a critical part of what this JSIDS redo can do.
Got it. Thanks, Doc. So, software is the primacy of what we do now, and software is going to change the way it's already changing the way we fight today, right? And software acquisition with all the new memos that have come out, it's great, but it's still not been adopted fully. I think, Jim, you talked about the bottom-up process, and Jack, you also mentioned like how does that change from perspective, right? Like, how does a process work today versus how should that bottom-up involvement be encouraged? I remember having a conversation with a bunch of O5s and O6. These were SecDef fellows a year ago, and always I hear about the frozen middle problem when I go talk to the enlisted folks that are wanting to use the technology. They are like, our requirements are not passing through. And then when I go talk to the flag officers, they're like, oh, I'm not hearing enough, or I want these changes done. And they both blame the frozen middle, right? And then when I ask these O5s and O6s, like, hey, they refer to you as the frozen middle. Why are you not implementing the changes? You were the ones complaining when you were below, and once you get promoted, you're going to complain about the same thing. Why not affect the change while you are in that role? And one thing that they said, like, career advancement is going to be a major issue for me if I start to rank the chain. So I'll stop there, and I want to hear you guys' your thoughts on.
I want to jump in on this and reinforce some things that have been said, but also maybe add a little bit of real experience here. Back again from from early Maven into the Jake days. Some of the challenges, I'm a strong proponent of DIU. I always have been. However, I also saw some of the challenges they faced, not just in the early DIU X days, but even pretty recently. They've changed their model I'd say in the last couple of years. But what was happening was down at those lower levels, people would go direct to DIUX and then to DIU, and they would get, look, we're going to help you out and help you build this thing that you need help with at a tactical level. The challenge was the services as a, sort of to put the Borg out there, did not either know about it or did not support it because they had never been told about it. They didn't program for it. They didn't budget within their services. And that led to some pretty serious disconnects. What we were able to do, as painful as it was, is we knew what the bottom up wanted. I mean, there was no question. We need help. This wasn't us driving. It was like, we can't do this anymore the old way. Give us something to solve this. What we had to do is then bring in the services one at a time and then together in these very senior level and then kernel level working groups, O6 working groups, to get buy-in to the point where having to say to them, we know you didn't budget for this. We agree we will pay the bills for the next fill in the blank, usually 2 years, 2 to 3 years, until you can put it in your long-term budget cycle. That is how we got them on board. And that's hard to do. That cost us a lot of time to do it, but it was the only way the services would say, you know what, I agree with you. The end user says they want it. You're going to budget for us. You're going to pay the bills for us for a couple of years. We're going to put it in the programming, long-term programming. I don't think that should have to happen for every program, but you do have, if it's a joint thing that benefits all the services, there has to be a way for everybody to get buy-in on what that thing is. So I think, Jags, really what you're getting at is you could go out to anybody in the world right now and find 1,000 different good ideas that should be bubbling up. It's this idea of getting those into the right people and then having somebody be their top cover to say to the services, this is so important, what's already on the books that could resemble something like this, or what needs to be added. So I think that's one example of how it could be done, but I think that's going to come down to, again, putting it into the program offices and giving people the empowerment and the accountability. I love what Doug said about the accountability piece. It has to be there to get these things moving faster than they are right now.
I think just to follow on what Jack's saying, Jags, you asked, how did requirements used to work? And I would say that requirements were often used as an excuse by services without resources to reject ideas they felt they couldn't afford or couldn't pursue, and it gave them a degree of control. At the same time, the people writing requirements were using the requirements process to try to drive behaviors and force the institution to do things, right? So they would use it to force S&T investment or force the development of certain kinds of capabilities, really, whether the budget supported it or whether technology could allow it to occur. And sometimes I think there are people that thought it's easier just to write a requirement and demand that it be met than to go through the trouble of aligning the institution around what's achievable and affordable. And so when I talk about using them as an enabling function, that requires a certain amount of open communication and trust that says, hey, we're going to establish a requirement that's broad enough to allow for innovation because we don't know exactly what we want to get out of it before we start. And especially on technology is moving so fast that you're not even trying to write requirements for what technology can do today. And I've heard people say this, we're trying to write requirements for what we think technology will do in 10 years when this actually gets fielded, which then in some cases would drive you into a lengthy development, right? And so I really do believe that we've got to get past the idea of using requirements to demand things of the institution and have leaders that can engage in the process to actually align the institution. They have to align money and concepts, technology, and some kind of requirements approval. And today, I think people think they're only responsible for one piece of that. And I think, Doug, you addressed this. You want to have people that are empowered. Nobody's empowered to do all of the things necessary. And you end up with a consensus process that requires a lot of horse trading to get anything approved. I tell the story that, when I was working on MRAP, we had the Undersecretary of Defense driving decisions and disciplining the whole process, and we were able to get changes made in a snap. But when it was a program of record like JLTV, just to get my test plan approved, I had to go get 32 signatures from 32 different organizations that were all demanding something different. And it's those kinds of behaviors and that kind of consensus building that I just don't think we have time for. Because if we make time for that kind of consensus, we're going to be late to need, and we're not going to be able to transform as rapidly as technology is moving or as rapidly as our adversaries. So, again, I'm not even talking about what I think the replacement for JSID should be as much as how I hope it behaves.
If you look at the behavior side of this equation, because I think that's really important, and I'll kind of elevate it up a little bit here, but there is a concept called supported and supporting. Okay. And right now, supported, is kind of the co-coms and whatnot. And the question is, can we flip this? Can we make for some class of activity that is relevant to their operational needs? Can we flip this around and say, okay, the co-coms are supported now? Okay. Number one, there is a pot of money that's been put here, and there is a functional way to get to senior leadership in a relatively short period of time. The first thing that you have to do in JSIDS, and it will be the first thing that you have to do here, is the senior leader asking for it, at least at the 4-star level, must say that tactics, techniques, and procedures cannot solve this problem, and I do not know of an existing capability within the department that could solve this problem. They have to certify that. Okay. And they'll answer to Congress if it's not correct. But that's kind of at the accountability piece of this equation. But we need to flip it around so that the services are supporting that combatant commander's emergent critical needs. And the beauty of what's going on here is that this is a venue by which we know software-defined activities can cross the valley of death much faster than a major program, build a new submarine, whatever. Okay. And so this is a way of keeping us in the loop, but we have to kind of flip this and make both the services want to support this, have a reasonable view across the entire department that there are no other solutions available to us, or if there are, they just need to be modified. And this is a quick modification of an existing capability, whatever it is. But my sense is we're not going to end up with whatever this new thing is solving all problems. Okay. And we're going to have to start to accept the fact that one of the things you get with AI in general is that it can dive down into the specifics and identify them and quickly move forward with them in ways that we couldn't do by throwing hundreds and hundreds of analysts at the problem. Okay. Or hundreds of things. And so moving things like modeling and simulation down to the regional combatant commanders so that they can get informed, data-driven solutions or definitions of problems in a way that is not just kind of, well, this is what we did in the last war, or this is what was built into the machine when it was being designed, and we're not going to change it. The one size fits all for the whole world and for 15 or 30 years just doesn't work. And, my sense here is that we'll end up with some bifurcation there. There'll be thresholds or whatever. My worry is that pot of money that's been promised out there will quickly be labeled a slush fund by the Congress. It will be a use or lose fund, unfortunately. So everybody will try to figure out how to game the system in order to get the money for their widget. And the regional commanders will now fall out of the game because they can't play that Washington game. They're disadvantaged tremendously in being able to do that. And so how we do that and how the department thinks about this is really a hard problem. I mean, it's human dynamics and it's bureaucratic, but I can tell you, I rewrote what was in the end named JSIDS 3 different times. And every time the product was a page and a half requirement. In other words, you could not exceed a page and a half. And within a month, the services, the budgeteers, all wanted, well, this thing you're building in 15 years, exactly what's it going to cost? Exactly how much money do I have to have? Exactly how high do you have to fly? You know, and 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 then you were forced into making this thing into a monster. So there needs to be kind of a way of looking at this that accepts that there's different systems and processes for different kinds of capabilities. And optimizing this system for the software side of the equation is so critical to our future success right now. And if we don't get this right, we'll be in trouble. But if we can't get that out to the edge so that their requests are data driven, analytically derived, and auditable, then we got a problem. If it's just what the whim of the commander happens to be at the time, or it's perceived as that, it won't be successful.
Thanks, Jim. That was great. I'm reading Freedom Forge right now, right? Like as we are preparing for this this near peer competition. One of the things that struck me out in that book was the United States Department of War at that time wasn't even thinking about bulk purchases. Right? If you were to buy uniforms, you bought 100 uniforms, say you paid $1,000, you paid 10x that when you ordered 10x quantity, never taking the economies of scale into account. That was then in the hard goods and the material side of things. Today, similar things are happening in the software side, right? You could buy an enterprise license agreement and you can slash the cost by 90% across the department, but each unit, they're separate, like, everybody's got their little fiefdom and they're buying separately. And I don't know if this is something that the new process could address. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts.
So, Jags, I think a lot of Jack mentioned earlier the push towards commercial as a first option. That has a couple interesting effects. One is it hopefully will discipline the requirements process to at least understand when they're asking for something that commercial can't deliver or that would require a bespoke solution. Because in the past, we would set requirements without regard to that. I'll say, secondly, I think there are some efforts ongoing for buying common things through the General Services Administration and some of that consolidation. And so I think there are some provisions for that. When I was the PEO for tactical communications for the Army, I would occasionally find myself choosing between a software license that had been negotiated at the enterprise level and what I could negotiate directly with those vendors. And there were times where I could get it cheaper. And so there's always this tension between, do you use an enterprise vehicle? Are there some things about that you can't quite live with? I think the future on things like commercial software is enterprise-wide licenses, but we do find ourselves in a position that says, okay, how many licenses are we going to pay for? And how much of that then goes unused? And so it does take a certain amount of smart buyer capacity to engage with those kind of vehicles in a way that that makes sense for both industry and the government.
There's been some interesting writing on this too, out of the Special Competitive Studies Institute on a dual track thing that says, hey, you keep talking about commercial stuff. Why not set up a whole separate acquisition system to truly, no kidding, buy commercial items? Because it's not part of our organization to know how to do the things that you just described. So set up a separate organization and have, different rules for how to procure those things. I think that's an interesting take, and hopefully one of the outcomes of this, and kind of gets back to the software memo that we described earlier too. Is like, no kidding, buy commercial and quit trying to change it. That seems to be a good way to get after that.
Where we're running into friction on that, Doug, is on things that are, when it's truly commercial, we have FAR Part 12, 15, right, that accomplishes that, relatively straightforward. And the price is established by the commercial marketplace, right? You get price discovery because there's actual commercial sales. I think where we run into problems is when there really aren't any commercial sales and it's not really commercial, but it's something industry paid to develop on their own. And then, there's a real push. I'll just say, when I was the DCMA director, I used to always question whether a company wanted it commercial so it would be easy to do business, or whether they wanted it to be commercial so they could charge whatever the hell they want. And so we got to be careful that we don't lose buying power with things that are kind of commercial, but where there's insufficient commercial sales to establish a fair and reasonable price.
I think there's a window of opportunity right now. An example that I'll use is at the early stages of the Gulf conflict, we paid in the neighborhood of tens of billions of dollars for additional intelligence analysts in order to scale to the problem that we had. But scaling was defined as how many more people do you need? Okay. And in my commercial side today, as a retired guy, what I'm watching is there are kind of two pathways here moving along, but one of them that is really driving hard, and you see it in the agriculture side of the equation, you're now starting to see it in manufacturing, is I can't find the people to go to scale. Okay. And if you apply those lessons learned that we're seeing in places like companies like John Deere and whatnot, is saying, okay, I'm going to give you an autonomous tractor, okay, because you can't find somebody that can drive this thing the number of hours I need to grow my pecans, or whatever it is. That is becoming a reality that we're dealing with. And so the idea that you're going to go out and buy, 100, and 50 analysts or whatever it is, just isn't realistic anymore. And it's the way most of our problems in the military were solved, was we threw bodies at them, okay, on a regular basis. And so there's a window of opportunity here on the positive side to start to think about the automation and how you justify the automation, return on investment, speed of which they can act, the purity of the product, et cetera. That's why I think it's so critical to start to get the analytic tools so that you can move to digital types of modeling, simulation tools that will tell you, okay, if you move this path and you get even 50% of what you think you could do, this makes a big difference, and the return is very quick. Okay. And so, I got going commercial, and I've certainly seen, particularly in the space side of the equation, that 9 times out of 10, the commercial solution is good enough for anything the Department of War needs, quite frankly. Okay. And so why wouldn't we let our commercial side start to go after these solutions? Okay. Instead of saying, you can't do that because I don't want you as good as me. Okay. And I don't want the rest of the world as good as what I think I could do. And so, there are these cultural issues that are in front of us. And I think that a lot of these areas are about to change dramatically, mainly because the workforce isn't available to do them the way we were doing them in the past. And two, the competitive advantage has to be gained and held, in a way that only software is going to be able to do it quickly.
Actually, I want to segue on that. Go back to something Haas was saying earlier. This idea of when we all have been involved in processes in the past of building requirements, and the number of the requirements just kept expanding, and sometimes the user's guilty of saying, "I wanted to do everything on the world and do it cheaply," and it was impossible. But are we? In the word, I think Doug used the word bifurcation. Could it be that we are rapidly approaching, or not, in a world where we can accept? None of us on this, everyone on this call, every one of us would never ever say that hardware is not important. I think sometimes people say, "Oh, your software mindset." We all know how important hardware is, but can we imagine that we're coming quickly to a place where the hardware requirements will be, quote unquote, good enough that they're not to the nth degree, and we rely on the software piece of it to make it into something special? What Haas said, I don't think enough people really focus on, other than the people who do this for a living, this idea of digital engineering and modeling and simulation, being able to do that at a speed that never has been possible before. Not to call out NVIDIA Omniverse, but that's one example of a company that works. I think it's BMW, build their whole factory floor digital, play it out in every possible scenario, and then you put it into production, and it just works on day one. I think we ought to be looking a lot more at how we do that, how we accept probably a more bounded set of hardware requirements, but leave the playing field wide open for the software so that latent AI can come in based on a new user requirement. Said, sure, that's just a little bit of an adjustment to the code. We've already figured out that the hardware will accept this through digital engineering principles. That's why I always go back to the program offices. They build it in accordance not with a piece of kit, but with digital engineering principles, with modular open systems approach, UCI, all the other things we want them to do, so that you can very rapidly, as like we're seeing happen in Ukraine every single day, adjust the software so you make an even more powerful piece of hardware. I think that's possible, but I think there are a lot of cultural issues that have to be addressed on this, that people aren't used to doing it that way. You know, the Will Ropers of the world, he's doing digital engineering in his commercial company now with Formula One. Hey, turns out that actually is a pretty good model for aircraft because of what they do in Formula One. So I don't have solutions to it other than I think we should be thinking a little bit differently about the hardware side to accommodate this incredibly rapidly moving software evolution.
I think one way to even imagine that is that, you know, I personally believe that there's probably not a requirements writer in the department that's capable of looking into the future and saying what edge AI can accomplish for our warfighters. They can't even imagine it. And the only way they're going to be able to imagine it is if we begin to show them the art of the possible, one use case at a time. And we shouldn't be waiting on the Pentagon to tell us that we've got requirements for that use case. Because if we wait for that, we're too slow. So I'm imagining a whole lot of broad running room, just kind of what you described, Jack, that says, you know, if it's a software thing, maybe the program manager can approve that, right? Up to a certain threshold. There's no requirements process at all. It's just one empowered person. Goes back to what Doug said, right? We have to empower somebody to say yes, particularly to software requirements, so that we can be, you know, quick and relevant. And we are not limited by the imagination of our requirements writers. I want to be limited by what technology can deliver on a given piece of hardware in a given environment, and then let everybody's imaginations run wild on what you can accomplish. I think we're seeing this, you know, all of us have had an opportunity to see what latent AI is doing on the edge. And what we're seeing is that we're seeing use cases that none of us imagined 2 years ago. So why should we expect the JSIDS process to think of it?
Great point, Dave. As a founder, right, like, you know, I've been running this company for 6 years. And one of the key things as a founder that I have learned is when you go to a customer, you're listening to them. And you're not just listening to what they're saying, you're observing what their needs are and what is the outcome that they're trying to drive. And that outcome will continue to change, right? Like, and this is a classic example that comes out of Tampa, is that when the special operators came back after a mission, they said like, hey, we got dropped in the middle of the night and we couldn't see. We need to have a ability to see. So let us get some flashlights in our kit so we can carry it. So if that was a requirement to be met, like, of course, you would have given them flashlights. But the question went on is like, okay, you wanted flashlights, but do you also want to be seen by your adversaries? Like, no, we want to be invisible. So that was the requirement that actually led to the creation of night vision goggles, right? This is where like a founder mindset comes in. If you had to write that requirement and to capture it, flashlights would have been part of every kit today, right? Night vision goggles would have never seen the light of day, right? Similarly, Edge AI, like we are doing right now, the team was in Ukraine, they got back, and we found the requirement where, and we all know that signal jamming is happening in the battlefield. How do you provide autonomy and last mile guidance for your projectiles or for your drones to execute certain missions? And that's where, like, since we operate at the edge, we can make the perception models and guidance models smaller. We can put that on the drone and let it go independent. Now, we bring that back here, and if we were to be bound by the JSIDS process, probably this will never see the day of the light, right? So how do we take a requirement like this or this capability, and how do we empower our warfighters? right? Do we go bottom up? Do we go top down? Love to hear you guys' thoughts.
To me, you're describing bottom up. I mean, pure and simple. The question becomes, how much bureaucracy and what's the level at which you can find somebody that can say yes. I can find plenty of people who have no votes in that chain, but to find the first yes vote, you've got to search that out. And like everybody's been saying, the lower we can push that, the more flexible and more responsive we can be to these emergent needs, particularly with software.
Yeah, and trying to, like in a scenario like you described, trying to overprescribe what those requirements would be, like starting with, hey, let's invent a concept of employment and a concept of ops, and then write a use case and flow requirements. The war will be over, right? To your point, we already have the tools. Let's get them in the operator's hands, then iterate on that very quickly. And the requirements process, the acquisition process, the funding process needs to be set up to allow that kind of agility, and then empower, an individual to take that risk and work directly with the operators to figure those things out in an iterative fashion. And it totally bottoms up.
I think there's one piece, Jags, to this that is really critical, that we haven't really touched on too much, but it is the adoption side of the equation. In other words, I can give you a good idea, and I can take you to warehouses in Afghanistan and Iraq where a lot of good ideas are parked. Okay, and when the guy who invented the idea, created the idea, leaves, it gets parked. Okay, and so trying to figure out how to move this through the adoption side of the curve. Okay, and in the commercial side, it's clear that broadening the base at which you use to uh, create, what we would call test and evaluation. So if instead of 20 or 30 of these really smart guys who are, who have done some skill for years and years, now look at what you got and test it. Instead, going out to the broader population of actual users being used, using this, and with software, go to hundreds or thousands of people simultaneously and say, okay, here's where we are. It looks good in the lab, okay, Mikey, take it. Only there's 1,000, Mikey. That process is dramatically increasing the speed at which you can take an institution and move bureaucracy quickly. Okay, because the voices now are either this is horrible and it doesn't work and there's too many edge cases, or it's wow, you know, and one size fits all of risk is not there. I mean, if it's MRAP and you really got people dying every day and you need to get it done, okay, then that's a risk that'll accept the 70, 80, 50% solution. Okay, as long as you can demonstrate you can reiterate this thing multiple times quickly. But we've got to look at that adoption curve too, because that's what really, it's not really, I don't think it's so much the middle as it is the entire institution is, okay, this is the way I've always done it. And so if you don't get them involved, you don't get them to say, "Oh, I'm a tester," And now that raising your hand is an adopter, okay, and it moves the needle a lot faster. So our approach to test and evaluation needs to dramatically shift. It needs to move up earlier in the activity, and it needs to be a much broader base.
So what I've advocated for on test, and I've certainly had my fights with the testers over the years. Our previous approach to test is to sort of test out all the risk out of a program. We want to test it exhaustively and understand 100% of what there is to know before we make any decisions. That isn't really possible. And in most cases, you only have the appearance of rigor. And so I think the key here, especially with software-based systems, is to understand capabilities and limitations. What does this thing do? What can it do? How can my soldiers use it? And you should not be trying to, especially with software-based systems that are going to change anyway, to exhaustively test every possible, permutation of what that software can do. You inform on capabilities and limitations. Half the time, by the time a report went to Congress telling us how terrible our software was, we'd already fixed it. And so we'd already iterated it 2 or 3 times. So we had a really precise report, maybe, on exactly what was wrong with the version of software we already got rid of 2 times ago. I'm not bitter, I swear. I swear I'm not bitter. But I think we got to shift that. We certainly do, with things that are changing that quickly.
Got it. All right, guys. We have about 8 minutes left. Love to hear closing remarks from each one of you, like, a minute long, and then we can turn it over to the Carahsoft team.
I'll jump in first. I mean, another thing we haven't really talked about that's not generally picked up in this conversation, but the front end of this thing is you need the energy and you need the parallel processing to do this. Okay. And the services and the department do not have that. Okay. You can use stopgaps, software as a service type activities out of IBM, AWS, et cetera. Programs like Janus, which is an Army program that is going to put islanded power at every facility and at every combatant command so that we can run parallel processing data centers at those same areas. That piece is dramatically underfunded. The Army has really, jumped in there with both shoes, but I think they're hoping somebody else is going to pay for it. But I think all of the services now have some activity going on at different places that get islanded power, and which is very clean and very pure to run these data centers and data center activities such that they can do this. Navy side of the equation is kind of paralleling or partnering with the civilian sector. So they're saying, I'm going to have this islanded power, but I'll give a percentage of it to your utility. And I'm going to have a fiber ring and we'll share this and you can build a smart city and I can build a smart, institution activity. And with Iron Dome coming and things like that, power and data centers, that parallel processing is a critical part of this ability.
What I'll add to that is if we could get a fraction of the money that these big tech companies are spending on data centers and energy infrastructure for training to focus on inference, on size, weight, and power constraints on the tactical edge, we could solve a lot. And then the only other thing I said, and it goes back to, again, something Haas was saying, I think we just have to understand we're going to be into this future in a fight where how much latitude and flexibility can we give down to that lowest possible level to adjust software on the fly? I think we have to do it. Question is, how do we do it right? There's the fact that we have 5 different units operating on different versions. Is that okay? I think in principle, yes, it is. But then how do you bring them back together again at some point? And to the other thing about we're not going to have enough people, we really are going to have partners in commercial industry to make up the difference, but they're going to have to be allowed to go to these forward locations and be there on site. In some cases, literally recoding on the spot based on user requirements changing based on unfolding things. I think some people are going to be uncomfortable with that, but I don't see any other way other than if you're in a fight, you have to give each individual user the ability to do something as fast as they do. If they got to wear a patch that says I can do local testing, give them a patch that says they can do local testing, send them somewhere for 6 months to learn how to do that and go out there. But I think that edge piece is going to be the next few years for the majority of this.
Dave?
So I think the end of JSIDS represents a critical opportunity. And it's going to be a test for our department, whether we can accept 80% solutions, whether we can create the space needed for us to innovate as an institution faster than our adversaries. We need to be able to innovate faster. We need to be able to empower leaders to make that happen. And we have to be willing to accept less than the perception of perfect knowledge before we make decisions. Because I had a question this week was about, hey, why doesn't the department buy, cheap disposable drones? And I said, well, we don't get requirements for cheap disposable drones. Our requirements drive us to bigger, heavier, more exquisite things. And so we're going to have to end with a process that does buy cheap and disposable over expensive and exquisite. And we're going to have to do it at the kind of scale we're going to need to do to take on very advanced adversaries. So I'm hopeful that the changes in the requirements process in JSIDS can be the start of that.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. Doug, last words.
Just, kind of back to your frozen middle discussion, nobody in the entire department shows up to work thinking that they're part of the frozen middle, right? They're all there to do what it is that's their job. Which, kind of to General Cartwright's earlier point on, all these processes and the people and things are continuing because that's literally what their job is. So you really need to get rid of a lot of process and a lot of that stuff to really bring about the changes that there is some promise for. On the PMs, they have the authority to do the things that we've described. It's really a question of risk tolerance, right? Too many of us grew up in a time when don't take any risk, and really it needs to flip around to how dare you not take an enormous amount of risk, especially when it comes to software, edge AI, things like that, and work directly with users, just like the way the rest of the world does it. So I think it's more about incentivizing them and kind of coaxing that behavior out while removing a whole bunch of layers and letting them go off and do their thing. So that's my final thought.
Excellent. Thanks, Doug. Guys, I think we can have another couple of hours of chat and we'll never the topics will keep coming, right? I learned so much and I think the future is bright if we can conquer it and get to a better process that brings better technology to our warfighter, right? With that, I'll turn it over to Samantha. Back to you.
Hi, Jax, thank you. And thank you to all of our amazing speakers. We really appreciate you being with us today. And we really hope this webinar has been helpful for you and your organization. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.